Hello, this is John Nance with Alltronic. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk about DE4000 firmware. We're going to talk a little bit about the old firmware, but we're primarily going to talk about the new firmware, the bootloader version. It's way easier, but with some of my people that have been using the DE4000 for some time, it's created a little bit of confusion for them. So we're going to kind of touch base on everything and just a quick recap. If you've been updating firmware since the birth of the DE4000, you'll know all about the fact that we send you a zip folder with the firmware version. This one happens to be 3.0.1. I'm going to open it, and inside of it we're going to see multiple files. We've always seen an update.atf file. Now if you're not familiar with this, pause, go back, contact us, reach out to us. We'll get you the document that talks about the old version of firmware. But you'll see the update ATF in there. You'll see subfolders with the terminal firmware in there. And you'll see a folder with the control board firmware. This is all the same. We're going to continue to send these versions of firmware out when we pack up a final public release firmware. But you're also going to see a new file in there called bootloader. Notice it'll have the same firmware name, 3.0.1.atf behind it, but it begins in bootloader. This one file contains all the three other files that I've showed you, and it only uses this bootloader feature for updating. So what's the advantage of this? Well, if you have old firmware and you want to get the newest firmware, you can install it one time. So if you're going from 2.5 to 3.1, 3.2, whatever coming up in the future, you can update it using the old method, using the ST-Link and the micro SD card, one step. But from that point, you can now use the bootloader on any future updates. The reason the engineers are releasing the firmware in these official releases with all or both formats is so you don't have to update it to 3.0.0, which was the first version of firmware release that we released the bootloader feature, and then have to proceed to update it a second time using the bootloader. So you can, if you're going from 2.8, let's say, you can use the firmware in the control file folder here, the terminal file folder, and then this update ATF to update one time. You're doing it the old-fashioned way. If you're updating from something that's 3.0.0 or newer, you can just go simply grab this bootloader and go straight to it. So with that, I've already created a thumb drive, and I've put these extra versions on here, 3.0.2 RC3 and a 3.0.2 RC4. Now these are release candidates, not released to the general public, but I'm going to show you how easy this is. So I've installed these files. They look like this, bootloader 3.0.2 RC3 on a thumb drive, and I've inserted the thumb drive into a USB slot on the control board for the DE4000. So I have powered down. I've power cycled my system. I am in a stop mode. It looks like I have a discrete stop command, and I have no RPM. So all I'm going to do is click the gear in the lower right hand corner and click System Info. Sounds familiar. And you'll notice, if you hadn't seen this screen before, that the screen looks slightly different. We'll give it a minute to update and refresh. What it's going to do is it's going to sniff out the files that are on the thumb drive that are installed on my thumb drive that I've inserted into the system, and we can see it just refreshed, and now all these things have firmware available. So one of the things that I've gotten to where I like to do for testing, through all the testing that I did with the engineers on this, is I like to do it in reverse order as it's listed. The HMI version is not applicable on this at all. We have a web app version, which is, think of that as your main operating system. We have a control version and a terminal board version. So this one happens to be a 2 terminal board program that I have currently loaded. I'm going to start with my terminal boards, then go to my control board, then my web app version. Let me show you how easy it is. I click firmware available. It's going to show me a list. So on the thumb drive, I have 3 different versions installed. I'm going to update to 3.0.2 RC4 because it's the newest version. I'm simply going to select it and I'm going to say proceed to update. It gives me a little bit of a warning. I'll give you time to read it. And then I'm going to click proceed. Another little bit of a warning. Begin update. And we can see that it shows our progress, and it actually goes fairly quick. At the end of the day, this is just as fast as updating it with the ST link. The advantage is it's one file on a thumb drive. I don't have to manage the ATF file, the control board file, and the terminal board files individually. I also do not have to pull all the screws and remove the covers off the boards and use additional hardware. It's just a simple thumb drive. Now, the one thing you don't want to do, and I can't answer the question what will happen, is interrupt power to the system during the update. I'm assuming not so good things. And we can see it says the firmware update for terminal board 2 has successfully completed. So what we're going to do is we're just going to move up the list to the next terminal board. And we can see that it just updated here. So now it shows that we have the RC4 version. I'm going to proceed to the next terminal board. So again, if anybody ever has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is john.nance, N-A-N-C-E, at Herbiger, H-O-E-R-B-I-G-E-R.com. We'll be happy to answer any of your questions. We have another successful update on Terminal Module 1. We'll move to the control board and repeat the whole process. And so again, rather than pulling out the ST link and a micro SD card, all this is one file loaded onto a thumb drive. We've used thumb drives successfully up to 64 gigabytes. I don't know if we can really get by with using thumb drives much bigger than that. We insert the thumb drive into the USB slot on the control board for the 4000 system. and go to this page. It takes it about 60 seconds to refresh to identify that the firmware is there. If it takes any longer than that, you may need to do a power cycle. Again, this feature is only available if you're starting with 3.0.0 or newer firmware. If you have something older, then you will have to use the 3 other files that I was showing you at the beginning of this video and use the old procedure. So don't go and throw away your ST-Link just yet. You're going to need to hang on to them because you never know what you're going to come up to out in the field, what version firmware is on it to begin with. One thing I have seen, if you have mismatched firmware, like that, you definitely want to follow the old ST-Link procedure. Okay, so we've successfully updated the 2 terminal boards and the 1 control board, and we're going to move now to update the web app version. And pretty much the same procedure. Now, like the more recent old version of firmware, this does not affect the JSON that's loaded into the program. So that's another thing. If you're ever into a situation where you need to totally wipe out the program that's in the system, kind of start fresh, you'll still need to use the recovery file for that procedure and use the micro SD card to initiate that. And that's a totally different scenario or process. But that recovery file is designed not to affect the firmware, but to just wipe out the JSON program that's in there to where it's just like the system just exactly like it was the day it was built and born on the factory floor up there in Ohio. Now, this one procedure for the web app version does take a little longer than updating the software or the firmware for the hardware boards. But you see it's going to skip, it's going to jump, we're up to 40% all of a sudden. That's a good thing. I'm expecting another big jump here in a minute and we'll be done. And we are complete. And once you've updated the web app version, this is normal. You'll see the web browser automatically update. It'll come back to the dashboard, so we just simply run back by clicking our gear in the lower right hand corner. I'm in system info in the top right corner. And we can see that everything, our boards and our web app version are now 3.0.2 RC4. Thank you very much for attending today's session. If you have any questions, once again, reach out to any of us at Alltronic at any time. We'll be happy and do our best to answer your questions. Thank you and have a great day.